Welcome. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears and let your breath find its own unhurried rhythm. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to remember. You can simply lie back and let these words drift over you like moonlight over water. Tonight, we wander through a quiet question about the sky above us and let it settle you slowly toward sleep. The moon has hung above us for 4.5 billion years. It formed, most researchers agree, from the debris of a collision between the young Earth and a Mars-sized world. That impact scattered rock and fire into orbit, and slowly it gathered into the pale companion we know. Tonight, we imagine gently what would happen if that companion simply disappeared. Tides would not vanish, but they would shrink. The sun still pulls at our oceans, though with far less strength than the moon. Coastal waters that once rose and fell with dramatic rhythm would settle into a gentler sway. Fishermen, shellfish, and shorebirds that time their lives to tidal pools would find their world rearranged, quietly, without warning. Earth's tilt would begin to wander. The moon's gravity steadies our planet's axis, keeping the seasons dependable and mild. Without it, over hundreds of thousands of years, the tilt could drift widely, the way a slow spinning top wobbles once nothing holds it steady. Ice ages might arrive in strange places. Deserts might bloom where forests once stood. Nights would grow far darker. The full moon, though it looks brilliant, only reflects a small fraction of sunlight, yet it is enough to cast shadows and guide night travelers. Without it, true darkness would return to our skies, broken only by starlight. Owls, moths, and nocturnal wanderers that navigate by moonlight would need to relearn their ancient paths. Ocean currents might slow. Tidal mixing, driven by the moon's pull, helps stir warm and cool waters together across the globe. Without that motion, deep currents could weaken, and heat might distribute differently across the seas. Climate patterns that took millennia to settle would begin, slowly, to reshape themselves into something new and unfamiliar. 24 hours would not stay 24 hours. The moon has been gradually slowing Earth's spin for billions of years, stretching our days by mere fractions of a second at a time. Without lunar drag, some astronomers estimate our day length would eventually stop lengthening, freezing at whatever pace remained. Time itself, in its smallest measure, would feel subtly altered. Migratory animals would lose a compass they never knew they used. Sea turtles, dung beetles, and certain birds rely partly on moonlight and its reflected patterns to orient themselves at night. Without that dim silver guide, their ancient navigation would grow uncertain. Nature's quiet clockwork, tuned across millions of years, would need to find new rhythms. Earth's sky would lose its gentlest light. Poets and lovers have long looked to the moon as a symbol of calm and distance, a familiar face returning each night. Without it, our night sky would feel emptier, though the stars themselves would shine undimmed, and perhaps even brighter, in the newfound dark. Meteor impacts might grow slightly more frequent. The moon's gravity and its scarred surface have long absorbed debris that might otherwise reach Earth. Without that quiet shield, a few more stones from space could find their way to us over long stretches of time. Yet even this, astronomers note, would unfold across ages too slow for any single life to notice. Eclipses, as we know them, would end entirely. The exact alignment of the moon covering the sun's disk is a rare cosmic coincidence, since both appear nearly the same size from Earth. Without the moon, that fleeting darkness at midday would never fall again. Future generations would read of totality only in old photographs and memory. Coral reefs time their spawning to the moon's glow. Many species release eggs and sperm together on specific nights tied to lunar phases, a synchronized event scientists still find remarkable. Without that dim signal, reproduction across vast reef systems could fall out of rhythm. Entire underwater nurseries depend on a light so faint most people never notice it. Stonehenge and monuments like it were built partly to track the moon's wandering path across the horizon. Ancient builders arranged stones to mark its rising and setting points through the seasons. Without the moon, those alignments would lose their meaning entirely, their silent stones pointing toward a sky that no longer answers. Whole calendars once built on lunar counting would need to be reinvented. A French astronomer named Jacques Lascar showed in 1993 that Earth's tilt might drift wildly without lunar stability. His calculations suggested obliquity could swing between extremes over millions of years, reshaping seasons entirely. It remains an open question how severe such swings would become. Mars, which has no large moon, shows exactly this kind of chaotic tilting today. Human sleep has long been rumored to follow the moon's rhythm. Folk wisdom claims restless nights arrive with the full moon, though careful studies offer mixed and modest evidence at best. Neuroscience has no final answer on whether moonlight truly stirs the sleeping brain. Still, the belief itself has endured for centuries, woven into stories long before anyone measured a single night's rest. Plankton drift according to tidal pulses shaped by the moon. Nutrient-rich waters rise and mix along coastlines during these cycles, feeding tiny organisms at the base of the ocean's food web. Without that stirring, some coastal ecosystems could shift in ways not yet fully understood. Fish populations, seabirds, and even distant fisheries trace their abundance back to this invisible lunar choreography. Sailors once steered entire voyages by watching the moon rise and set. Before compasses existed, its position offered rough bearings across open water, alongside the stars. Losing it would have meant losing one of humanity's oldest natural instruments. Even after instruments improved, many captains still glanced skyward out of habit, trusting the old silver guide above the waves. Earth and its moon quietly circle a shared point in space, called the barycenter, tucked beneath our planet's surface. That invisible pivot has anchored their dance for billions of years. Without the moon's mass, Earth would simply spin alone around the sun, its motion suddenly simpler, lonelier, and less finely balanced than it has ever been. Tidal pools along rocky shores would shrink without the moon's steady pull. Barnacles, anemones, and small crabs depend on the rhythm of rising and falling water to feed and breathe. Their world, a narrow strip between land and sea, exists because of that ancient gravitational rhythm. A weaker tide would narrow their home, tightening the margins these small creatures have always lived within. Every space mission that ever passed near the moon used its gravity as a stepping stone. Spacecraft bound for distant planets often looped around it, borrowing momentum before continuing outward. Without that nearby body, early exploration might have taken a very different shape. The moon has been, in its quiet way, a launching stone for humanity's reach into the wider dark. Bright rock faces on distant cliffs owe part of their story to lunar light reflecting across ancient waters, guiding early navigators who charted coastlines long before maps existed. Fishermen along scattered shores learned to read its glow for safe passage home. Without that reflected light, early coastal travel would have depended far more heavily on memory, stars, and pure chance. Deep within limestone caves, certain blind creatures still respond to faint shifts in air pressure tied to tidal pull far above them. Cave crickets and subterranean fish adjust their movement to these hidden signals, though no direct sunlight or moonlight ever reaches them. Removing the source of that pull would ripple downward, unseen, into ecosystems most people never imagine exist. Ancient Chinese astronomers recorded lunar positions with extraordinary precision, building calendars that guided planting seasons for entire dynasties. Farmers depended on those calculations to know exactly when to sow rice, long before written science explained why. Losing that steady reference point would have unraveled centuries of agricultural timing built entirely around its dependable path. Northern auroras owe part of their vivid dance to Earth's magnetic field, a field partly stabilized by the steady gravitational balance the Moon helps maintain. Without that balance, some researchers propose the field itself could behave less predictably over immense stretches of time. The shimmering green curtains above the poles might flicker differently in a world reshaped by that missing anchor. 900 million years ago, days on Earth lasted only about 18 hours, stretched slowly longer by lunar drag over immense spans of time. That gradual lengthening continues even now, adding mere fractions of a second per century. The light reaching your eyes tonight travels across the sky, shaped by that same unhurried lengthening, still happening this very hour. Deep beneath ocean waves, whales appear to time long migrations partly around subtle tidal shifts influenced from above. Humpbacks and gray whales travel thousands of kilometers, guided by cues layered atop currents, temperature, and light. Removing one thread from that tapestry would not end their journeys, but it could quietly alter timing built across countless generations. Egyptian priests once tracked lunar cycles alongside the flooding of the Nile, weaving both into religious ceremony and agricultural planning. Temples were aligned with precision toward specific points on the horizon where it would rise, their entire civilization's sense of time bent gently around that dependable arc crossing the desert sky. Wolves howling across frozen valleys were long believed to call toward a glowing companion overhead, though biologists now understand the behavior differently. Howls mark territory and rally packs regardless of sky conditions. Still, the image endured across folklore for centuries, tying predator and satellite together in stories told beside firelight. 12 astronauts once walked across lunar dust, leaving footprints that remain undisturbed by wind or rain to this day. Their bootprints sit frozen in airless silence, a fragile record of humanity's farthest physical reach. Those tracks exist because something solid was there to receive them, something whose absence would erase an entire chapter of human history. Werewolf legends across scattered cultures often trace back to fear of the unknown night, projected onto whatever light pierced the darkness. Storytellers needed a symbol for transformation, and its pale glow offered an obvious canvas. Without that recurring presence, mythology itself might have reached for entirely different symbols to explain humanity's oldest fears. Volcanic activity on Earth owes a sliver of its rhythm to the planet's gravitational flexing, a stretch and release caused by our companion's pull. Crust bends by mere millimeters, easing pressure along certain fault lines. Remove that rhythmic squeeze, and geologists suspect the pattern of eruptions could shift, though only by the faintest measurable margin. Fishermen along tropical shores have long timed their nets to the glow above the horizon, knowing certain fish rise nearer the surface under its brightness. Generations passed down these unwritten schedules before anyone understood tidal biology. Without that pale beacon, their catch would still come, but the old timing charts etched into memory would lose their meaning. Farther inland, certain desert beetles navigate using polarized rays scattered across the night sky. Its brightness helps scatter that pattern evenly, giving small creatures a readable map across featureless dunes. Remove the source, and the sky would darken unevenly, leaving faint trails of starlight as the only remaining guide across the sand. Coastal cities built centuries ago positioned their harbors according to predictable tidal swings. Venice, for instance, grew around canals shaped by dependable rises and falls in water level. Engineers of that era trusted a rhythm written into the sky, never suspecting how deeply their entire city's foundation depended on it. Certain species of turtles emerge from sand nests, guided partly by subtle brightness differences across the horizon. Hatchlings instinctively crawl toward the brighter open water rather than darker dunes inland. Artificial light already confuses this instinct along developed coastlines, and losing a steady natural glow altogether would strip away one of their oldest built-in compasses. A physicist named George Darwin, son of Charles Darwin, proposed in the 1870s that Earth and its companion once spun far closer together, locked in a faster orbital dance. His calculations suggested the two bodies have been drifting apart ever since, inch by inch, across immense stretches of geological history. Today, that separation continues at a pace slower than fingernail growth. Certain owls hunting through forest canopies rely on brightness contrast to spot movement below. Prey animals scurry differently, depending on how much illumination reaches the forest floor. Ecologists studying nocturnal predators note that hunting success rates shift measurably between bright and dark phases, a pattern built into countless food chains across wooded regions worldwide. Ancient Babylonian astronomers kept meticulous clay tablet records, tracking its phases across centuries, some of the oldest astronomical documents ever discovered. Their observations eventually allowed early scholars to predict eclipses with startling accuracy. That patient record-keeping, stretching across dynasties, became one of humanity's first true sciences, built entirely around watching a single object in the sky. Deserts undergo dramatic temperature swings each night, and reflected glow softens that harshness by a small but measurable degree. Sand that would otherwise plunge into deep cold retains a touch more warmth under a bright sky. Without that faint addition, nocturnal desert temperatures would drop just slightly further, altering conditions for creatures already living at the edge of survival. Taintless love songs, poems, and paintings across centuries have used its glow as a symbol for longing, distance, and devotion. Artists reached instinctively toward that steady, unreachable light when words for human emotion fell short. Its disappearance would leave behind not just a darker sky, but an empty space in humanity's shared language of romance and reflection. Rice farmers across old river valleys once watched its rising to decide planting dates. Certain crop cycles followed brightness patterns as reliably as any written calendar. Agricultural knowledge passed through generations often carried these observations quietly folded into folklore, proverbs, and seasonal songs. Losing that steady marker would strip away one of farming's oldest unspoken instruments. Deep ocean fish living far below sunlight still respond to faint pressure shifts tied to tidal rhythm above. Bioluminescent creatures adjust their glowing displays according to these barely perceptible cues. Marine biologists tracking such behavior in total darkness find patterns nearly impossible to explain without a distant pull reaching even the deepest trenches. The connection between surface and abyss runs deeper than sunlight ever could. Roman engineers built harbor walls with tidal ranges carefully measured into their designs. Their calculations relied on predictable rises and falls repeating across seasons without fail. Ports thrived because builders trusted a rhythm older than the empire itself. Without that dependable pulse, ancient maritime trade routes might never have flourished the way they did. Snow leopards prowling high mountain ridges hunt more successfully under brighter night skies. Their pale fur blends seamlessly with moonlit rock and snow, granting silent approach toward unsuspecting prey. Wildlife researchers tracking these elusive predators note shifts in hunting behavior tied directly to sky brightness. A darker world would reshape survival strategies built across countless generations of stealth. 900 generations of sailors before satellite navigation existed relied on predictable brightness to judge distance across open water. Ship logs from centuries past describe glowing horizons guiding entire fleets safely home. Naval historians studying these records find repeated praise for a companion overhead that never failed to appear. Its steadiness once meant survival itself, not merely comfort. Inuit storytellers across Arctic regions wove its phases into oral histories passed down across centuries. These tales often explain seasonal darkness, animal migration, and survival wisdom through characters tied to its glow. Anthropologists recording these traditions find striking consistency across isolated communities separated by vast frozen distances. Shared wonder, it seems, does not require shared geography. Bats hunting through open meadows rely on brightness contrast to spot fluttering insects against the sky. Echolocation handles close details, but ambient glow still shapes broader hunting patterns across open terrain. Bat researchers observing colonies note reduced activity during darker phases of each month. A permanently darker sky would alter feeding rhythms built into their biology across ages. Medieval cathedral builders sometimes aligned window placements to catch its light streaming through stained glass on particular nights. Architectural historians studying old church records find deliberate design choices tied to specific celestial timing. These illuminated moments carried spiritual weight for entire congregations gathered in candlelit stone halls. A vanished glow would have left those windows dark on nights once considered sacred. Certain spiders spinning webs across open fields adjust thread placement according to ambient night brightness. Ecologists studying orb weavers find subtle shifts in web geometry between bright and dark nights. Reflected light apparently helps flying insects notice silk strands, altering how effectively webs catch prey. Even something as fine as spider silk carries a hidden thread of influence from above. Its presence has shaped instinct, architecture, migration, and memory across every corner of this planet, threading through lives too small and too large to notice consciously. Each creature, each culture, each quiet night carried some trace of that steady companion overhead. The story of its influence stretches wider than any single fact could hold, reaching into places we are only beginning to understand. River deltas across Southeast Asia flood and recede according to tidal timing shaped from above. Farmers planting near these waterways learned centuries ago to read those rhythms before any calendar existed. Hydrologists mapping these deltas today still find agricultural patterns tracing back to lunar-driven flood cycles. A steadier or vanished pull would rewrite flooding patterns that entire villages depend upon. Sea turtles crossing vast ocean distances appear to orient themselves partly through subtle magnetic cues layered beneath brighter horizons. Marine biologists tracking these journeys note higher navigational accuracy during predictable nighttime brightness. No one yet knows the full extent of how much these two senses intertwine. Removing one thread from that navigation system might leave the other straining to compensate. Norwegian fishing villages built entire seasonal calendars around predictable tidal swings tied to lunar timing. Elders once taught children which nights brought safer waters for small wooden boats to venture out. Maritime historians studying these coastal communities find generations of accumulated knowledge passed through spoken tradition rather than written record. That inherited wisdom depended entirely on rhythms no one could see but everyone could trust. Certain crickets chirping through summer nights adjust their calling rhythms according to ambient brightness levels. Entomologists recording these patterns across open fields find quieter, more sporadic calls during darker phases. Predators hunting by contrast may explain part of this cautious behavior. A permanently dim sky might shift these tiny nightly performances into an unfamiliar silence. Venetian gondoliers once timed evening routes through the canals according to brightness reflecting off the water. Historical records from the city describe safer passage on nights when the horizon glowed enough to reveal hidden turns. Tour guides today still repeat old stories about boatmen who trusted that reflected shimmer more than any lantern. A darker canal system would have demanded far greater caution from those quiet night crossings. Deep within Andean highlands, ancient stargazers carved observation platforms aligned toward specific points along the horizon. Archaeologists studying these sites find patterns matching lunar rising positions across long cyclical periods. Ceremonies were apparently timed around these alignments, weaving agricultural planning into ritual observance. Ordinary stone, shaped with such intention, still holds a memory of skies once carefully studied. Migratory moths crossing continents at night appear to use brightness gradients as one navigational cue among several. Researchers tracking these insects with tiny transmitters find flight paths shifting subtly across different lunar phases. The full mechanism remains an open question within entomology. Something as delicate as a moth's wing beat may carry, unnoticed, the influence of a companion far above. Along volcanic coastlines in Indonesia, fishermen once read tidal pools to predict incoming storms days before clouds appeared. Oceanographers studying these traditional forecasting methods find surprising accuracy tied to gravitational tidal patterns preceding weather shifts. Passed through generations without formal instruction, this knowledge blended observation with inherited intuition. Losing such tidal predictability would have stripped away an early warning system built from patient watching. Certain frogs calling from wetland edges appear to synchronize chorus timing with brightness levels overhead. Herpetologists recording these choruses across different nights find louder, longer calling sessions during brighter phases. Predator visibility likely shapes part of this cautious rhythm. A steadily darker wetland might quiet these evening choruses into something far more hushed than nature intended. Across centuries, sailors and scholars alike returned again and again to the same quiet observation that steady overhead presence shaped tides, instinct, harvest, and memory in ways too vast to fully separate from daily life. Each culture found its own language for that influence, yet the underlying rhythm remained the same everywhere it touched. Understanding how deeply woven that influence became makes its sudden absence feel less like losing an object, and more like losing a rhythm the whole living world had long since learned by heart. High above the Himalayas, monastery bells were rung at hours chosen partly by lunar timing, marking night rituals meant to align inner practice with celestial rhythm. Monks kept oral records of when the sky glowed brightest, weaving those observations into meditation schedules passed master to student. Anthropologists studying these traditions note how deeply timekeeping and spiritual life intertwined. A sky stripped of that glow would have left those ancient bell ringers measuring night by guesswork alone. Salmon, returning upstream to spawn, appear to time portions of their journey around subtle shifts in river brightness at night. Biologists tracking these runs note behavioral changes across differing lunar phases, though the full sensory pathway remains unclear. Instinct honed across countless generations may lean on cues too subtle for casual observation. Rivers running darker night after night might quietly reshape a migration written into fish since before memory began. Egyptian sailors on the Red Sea once judged safe passage through narrow reefs by watching how light scattered across the water's surface after dusk. Maritime historians describe routes charted specifically around nights when that glow was strongest, avoiding the treachery of hidden coral. Cargo, crews, and entire trading seasons depended on such careful reading of the sea. Losing that glow would have forced ancient navigators into far riskier, blinder crossings. Owls nesting in temperate forests hunt with greater success on nights when contrast across the forest floor sharpens beneath an open sky. Wildlife researchers observing hunting patterns note shifts in prey capture rates tied to these shifting conditions. Silhouettes of scurrying rodents become easier to detect when contrast deepens against pale ground. Without that overhead glow, An owl's careful patience might yield far less across a long hunting night. Along the coastlines of ancient Peru, fishermen wove reed boats and launched them according to tidal timing tied to celestial position overhead. Archaeological evidence from coastal middens shows fishing intensity correlating with predictable cycles across centuries. Entire communities structured labor, rest, and trade around this dependable pulse of the sea. A vanished pull from above would have unraveled a rhythm those villages had trusted for generations. Bees returning to their hives after dusk appear to orient partly using polarized light patterns scattered across the sky, patterns shaped in part by an overhead glow reflecting sunlight. Entomologists studying hive behavior note subtle disruptions when that reflected light dims unexpectedly. Navigation honed over millions of years may depend on cues layered far beyond simple daylight. Removing that pale companion overhead might leave returning bees searching longer through unfamiliar dark. Iceland's fishing communities historically planned harbor departures according to how brightly the sea reflected light on a given evening. Maritime folklore from the region speaks of crews delaying voyages during unusually dark nights, wary of navigating unseen currents. Modern instruments have replaced this old habit, yet the stories remain part of coastal memory. A permanently darker sea might have made such caution the only rational choice night after night. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, certain nocturnal primates time their foraging routes around shifting canopy illumination overhead. Primatologists tracking these movements observe longer, more confident foraging on nights when light filters more clearly through leaves. Predator avoidance likely shapes part of this behavior alongside simple visibility. A canopy plunged into deeper darkness might shrink these careful nightly journeys into something far more cautious. Nomadic herders across Mongolia's steppes once timed long overnight treks according to how clearly distant landmarks stood out against the horizon glow. Ethnographers recording oral histories describe entire migration routes memorized partly through recurring lunar patterns across changing seasons. Livestock, families, and generations of accumulated knowledge move together under that dependable overhead rhythm. Losing it would have stripped travelers of a landmark older than any map. Across every ocean, forest, desert, and frozen coastline studied so far, life appears to have folded that steady overhead rhythm into its most basic patterns of movement, rest, and reproduction. Each creature and culture found its own quiet accommodation, shaped slowly across unimaginable stretches of time. Considered together, these countless small adaptations suggest something larger than coincidence, a companion whose influence reached further into daily existence than most people ever pause to notice. Australian Aboriginal songlines wove lunar timing into oral maps stretching across vast desert distances. Anthropologists studying these traditions describe travelers gauging safe walking hours by watching how clearly the horizon separated from the sky. Water sources, hunting grounds, and seasonal gatherings were remembered partly through this dependable overhead marker. A sky without it might have erased a memory system carried across countless generations. Portuguese explorers charting unfamiliar coastlines during the Age of Sail relied on lunar position to estimate longitude before reliable instruments existed. Maritime historians note how captains cross-referenced star charts with the visible companion above to correct their bearings mid-ocean. Entire voyages of discovery depended on this imperfect but steady method. Without it, early transatlantic crossings would have drifted far more blindly across open water. Emperor penguins huddling through Antarctic winters appear to shift huddle density on evenings when the sky offers stronger contrast against the ice. Behavioral ecologists tracking colony movement suggest visibility may influence how tightly groups cluster for warmth. Predator awareness likely plays some role alongside temperature alone. A permanently dim polar sky might have left these huddles slower to reorganize, more vulnerable to unseen approach. 12,000 years ago, early hunter-gatherers across the Fertile Crescent may have timed seasonal hunts partly around a familiar overhead cycle marking safe travel windows. Archaeologists studying early tool caches near migration routes note clustering, aligned with recurring calendar phases. Survival depended on reading every available signal the sky offered. Losing such a signal would have forced entire bands to rebuild their sense of timing from nothing. Coastal mangrove crabs, emerging from burrows along tropical shorelines, appear to time surface activity around subtle shifts in ambient sky illumination. Marine biologists studying these burrows note consistent emergence patterns linked to overhead cycles rather than temperature alone. Predator avoidance and feeding opportunity both seem tied to this timing. A sky stripped of its familiar cycle might scatter these emergences into something far less predictable. Medieval European monasteries kept detailed manuscripts recording lunar phases beside agricultural notes, treating the two as inseparable knowledge. Historians examining surviving parchments describe monks cross-referencing planting dates with recurring overhead cycles across decades. This careful record-keeping preserved continuity through wars, famine, and shifting rulers. A vanished cycle would have left blank pages where centuries of careful observation once stood. Deep beneath coral atolls in the Pacific, certain reef fish spawn in synchronized bursts tied to a dependable overhead cycle that shifts water chemistry ever so slightly. Marine researchers studying these events describe entire populations releasing eggs within the same narrow window, year after year. Coordination across such vast numbers of individuals depends on some shared external cue. Removing that cue might scatter spawning into something far less unified. Ancient Mesoamerican observatories, built by Maya astronomers, tracked lunar movement with instruments precise enough to predict eclipses centuries in advance. Archaeoastronomers studying these structures describe carved markers aligned toward specific points along a wandering horizon path. Entire ceremonial calendars depended on this careful observation, passed down through generations of priests. A sky without such movement would have left these ancient calculations without any purpose left to serve. Reindeer herding communities across Scandinavia's far north once timed long winter treks according to how clearly snow reflected available overhead light. Ethnographers recording herding traditions describe entire routes chosen based on visibility across open tundra during the darkest months. Herds moved safely partly because handlers could judge terrain from reflected illumination alone. A permanently dim tundra might have made such treks considerably more dangerous, mile after mile. Considered together, these scattered traditions and instincts form something like a quiet inheritance, passed from creature to creature, culture to culture, without any single origin point. No one designed this dependence deliberately. It simply accumulated, one adaptation folding into another across unimaginable spans of time, until an entire planet's rhythm came to lean, however lightly, on a companion most living things never once looked up to name. Shepherds moving flocks through the mountains of Greece-timed descents to valleys, according to how well terrain could be judged after dusk. Herding families passed down routes memorized across seasons, adjusting for how the sky's glow revealed rocky paths. And niching, falling stock or lost animals were rarer on clear cycles than dark ones. Without that steady illumination, descending narrow trails would have demanded far greater caution. Freshwater eels migrating from European rivers toward distant spawning grounds appear to time portions of their journey using cues tied to tidal rhythm. Biologists tracking these long migrations describe eels gathering near estuary mouths before tides align favorably for departure. This coordination allows young eels to conserve energy on their eventual return upstream. A world without such tidal timing might scatter these journeys into far less efficient wandering. Bedouin travelers crossing the Arabian desert once judged safe hours for movement according to how clearly dunes and ridgelines stood against the sky. Caravans avoided daytime heat, choosing instead to travel when the terrain remained visible enough to navigate safely. Camels and riders alike depended on this careful timing across vast, featureless stretches. Losing that visibility would have made desert crossings considerably riskier, step after careful step. Certain species of jellyfish drifting through open coastal waters appear to pulse and gather according to shifting tidal strength tied to a dependable cycle above. Marine researchers observing these blooms describe denser gatherings occurring near peak tidal windows, then dispersing as conditions ease. Feeding efficiency seems linked to this rhythm, allowing clusters to intercept passing plankton. Disrupting that rhythm might leave such blooms scattered thin across the water. Along the cliffs of coastal Wales, ancient burial mounds were positioned with entrances facing specific points where a wandering path once crossed the horizon. Archaeologists studying these structures describe careful stone alignment, matching known extremes of that path across long cycles. Builders seem to have devoted enormous effort toward marking something they could not fully explain. A sky without that path would have left these monuments pointing toward nothing at all. Deep within Japanese tide pools, certain octopuses adjust hunting activity according to how far water recedes during predictable low-tide windows. Researchers observing these creatures describe more confident foraging when exposed rock pools offer easier access to trapped prey. Timing appears learned rather than instinctive, passed through repeated exposure to consistent tidal cycles. Without that consistency, such foraging strategies would lose the reliable structure they depend upon. Farmers across the Nile Delta once staggered planting across weeks according to how flooding aligned with observed cycles overhead, believing the two forces moved together. Written records from ancient Egypt describe priests advising farmers on timing based on this combined observation. Crop yields seemed, in their eyes, tied to getting such alignment correct. Whether or not the connection was truly causal, the belief shaped agricultural decisions for centuries. Certain bat colonies roosting in Central American caves appear to delay evening departures on cycles when little illumination reaches the forest canopy, favoring safer, darker cover. Field biologists studying these colonies describe measurable shifts in emergence timing tied to how much reflected light filters through treetops. Predator avoidance seems to drive this behavior more than convenience. A permanently dim canopy might simplify such decisions, removing the variable altogether. Whaling ships during the Age of Sail often planned harpoon runs according to how clearly a pod's movement could be traced across dark water. Ship logs from the period described captains waiting for favorable conditions before ordering pursuit, favoring visibility over haste. Crews depended on this judgment to avoid dangerous, poorly seen maneuvers near the hull. Losing such visibility would have made an already perilous trade considerably more uncertain. Considered across cultures, professions, and species alike, a single dependable presence seems to have quietly organized countless separate decisions, from harvests to hunts to long migrations. None of these traditions required understanding why the sky behaved as it did. It was enough that it behaved predictably, cycle after cycle, offering something steady to plan around in a world otherwise full of change. High in the Andes, llama herders traditionally moved animals across mountain passes, guided by clear brightness cast over rock and snow. Elders in these communities recall choosing travel nights based on how well the trail ahead could be seen. Poor visibility meant waiting, sometimes for days. Without a reliable glow to trust, such journeys would have depended entirely on memory and starlight alone. Fireflies flashing through humid summer meadows appear to adjust signaling intensity depending on how much light already fills the sky. Entomologists tracking these insects note dimmer competition on darker nights, making each flash easier to notice. Brightness above seems to shape a delicate signaling contest below. A sky stripped of its usual glow might quietly rewrite these summer courtships altogether. Norwegian stave churches built centuries ago include small windows positioned to catch reflected glow during long winter nights. Historians studying these wooden structures describe builders working carefully around limited daylight hours, using every available source of illumination. Worship continued through darkness with help from whatever light the sky offered. Losing that source would have deepened winter's already heavy shadow inside these halls. Coastal Chilean fishermen historically read water clarity each evening before deciding whether nets could safely be cast near rocky shoals. Oral tradition passed through generations described certain nights as favorable, others as too risky to attempt. Judgment depended on how clearly submerged rocks could be spotted beneath the surface. Removing that clarity would have left every evening equally uncertain, equally hazardous. Deep in Borneo's rainforest canopy, flying squirrels appear to glide more frequently on brighter nights when gaps between branches are easier to judge. Field researchers observing these animals describe hesitation during darker stretches, favoring shorter, safer leaps instead. Depth perception across open canopy gaps seems tied closely to available illumination. A permanently dim forest floor might quietly limit how far these creatures ever dare to travel. Ancient Persian caravans crossing the Zagros Mountains timed steep descents according to how well footing could be judged along narrow trails. Travelers' accounts from centuries past describe caution on darker nights when a single misstep near a cliff edge carried real danger. Visibility, more than speed, determined whether a caravan moved forward or waited until conditions improved. That old caution reveals just how much trust was placed in the sky above. Certain moths in temperate forests appear to time wingbeat frequency changes with shifts in ambient brightness through the night. Biologists tracking these insects describe subtle adjustments that seem tied to how easily predators can spot movement against a paler sky. Survival, in this small way, depends on reading light correctly. A darker world would remove one layer of danger while introducing others entirely unfamiliar. Along Portugal's Algarve coast, medieval salt harvesters timed evaporation pond work around how brightly water reflected during long overnight shifts. Historical accounts describe workers relying on reflected glow to check crystallization progress without needing torches, which risked contaminating the salt. Careful observation replaced artificial light entirely. Losing that steady reflection would have forced an entirely different, more difficult approach to an ancient trade. Snowy owls hunting across Arctic tundra rely on contrast between pale snow and dark prey silhouettes, contrast made sharper under brighter night skies. Wildlife researchers describe measurably higher hunting success during these clearer conditions compared to overcast nights when shapes blur together. Precision for these birds depends on light doing its quiet work first. Removing that steady illumination would blunt one of their sharpest natural advantages. Considered together, these small adaptations, human and animal alike, reveal something remarkably consistent across distant corners of the planet. Wherever creatures needed to judge distance, danger, or timing after dusk, they turned toward the same dependable brightness in the sky. It asked nothing in return, offering only steady light to whoever looked up and used it well. Beekeepers in rural Slovenia once checked hive activity late in the evening by watching how clearly the entrance could be seen against the surrounding dark. Written farm journals from small villages mentioned delaying inspections when clouds obscured the sky, worried about disturbing bees unnecessarily. Clear conditions meant confident, careful handling. A permanently obscured sky would have made this quiet nightly ritual far harder to trust. Herring gulls nesting along British cliffs adjust foraging flights based on how easily the shoreline can be judged after sunset. Ornithologists tracking these birds note longer hesitation before takeoff during heavily clouded evenings when depth cues across rock faces disappear. Confidence in flight seems tied to visible contrast along familiar cliff edges. Without that contrast, a colony's evening routine would shift in ways still hard to predict. Ethiopian highland farmers once staggered harvest nights according to how well grain stalks could be distinguished from surrounding shadow. Oral histories describe entire families working past dusk only when conditions allowed safe footing among uneven furrows. Brightness, in this setting, decided whether labor continued or paused until morning. Losing that dependable illumination would have reshaped an entire agricultural rhythm built across generations. Barn owls hunting across English farmland rely on subtle brightness differences to spot small movement in open grass. Field studies show measurably slower reaction times during dense cloud cover, when prey silhouettes blend into darker terrain. Precision hunting for this species depends heavily on a clear night sky doing its part first. A dimmer world would quietly narrow the margins these birds have relied on for centuries. Along Brittany's rugged coastline, oyster farmers historically checked tidal flats before dawn, using reflected brightness across wet sand. Generations of workers describe judging safe walking paths this way, avoiding deeper channels hidden beneath shallow-looking water. Careful observation, passed from parent to child, replaced any need for artificial signals. Without that reflected guide, early morning harvests would have carried far greater risk. Fennec foxes hunting across Saharan dunes appear to rely on faint contrast between pale sand and darker prey shapes scattered nearby. Zoologists observing these small animals note more confident, direct approaches during clearer conditions overhead. Hesitation increases noticeably when that contrast fades. Even in one of Earth's driest places, a distant companion in the sky seems to shape how survival unfolds each evening. Fishermen along Croatia's Dalmatian coast historically read reflected brightness across the Adriatic to judge whether calm seas would hold through the night. Older accounts describe entire fleets delaying departure when that reflection grew unpredictable or dim. Trust in the water's surface, more than instinct alone, guided these decisions. Removing that steady reflection would have forced captains toward far riskier guesswork. Certain species of tree frogs in Central American rainforests appear to time calling bursts around subtle shifts in ambient brightness filtering through the canopy. Researchers recording nocturnal choruses note quieter, shorter calls during heavily overcast stretches. Communication itself for these small creatures seems partly shaped by conditions overhead. A permanently darker canopy might soften an entire layer of forest sound built over countless generations. Dutch windmill keepers once scheduled certain grinding tasks according to how well moving sails could be seen against the surrounding dark. Historical records mention pausing work during particularly murky evenings, wary of mechanical accidents in poor visibility. Brightness overhead offered a simple, reliable safeguard long before artificial lighting existed. That old dependence reveals how deeply ordinary labor once leaned on the sky. Considered all together, these countless small habits, drawn from forests, coastlines, deserts, and quiet farmland, describe a planet shaped gently by one dependable presence in its sky. Creatures never asked why it was there. They simply adjusted generation after generation around brightness that always seemed to return. That quiet reliability, woven through instinct and tradition alike, forms part of the story this vanished light would leave behind. High along Nepal's mountain trails, Yak herders once judged safe river crossings by watching how clearly water surfaces reflected the sky. Older guides recall wading through darker nights rather than risking hidden currents. Trust, built over years, replaced any modern instrument. Losing that reflected guide would have turned familiar crossings into genuine gambles. Deep within Scottish sea locks, harbor seals appear to time hunting dives around shifts in surface light filtering down from above. Marine biologists tracking their movements note longer, bolder dives on clearer nights. Shorter, cautious dives follow when that light thins. A creature built for darkness still seems tethered, in small ways, to what happens far above the waterline. 1,200 years ago, Polynesian navigators crossing open Pacific waters read the horizon's glow to hold a steady course between distant islands. No charts existed for these voyages, only memory and sky passed between generations. Steady light offered a fixed point when every wave looked the same. Without it, those long crossings would have demanded a different kind of courage entirely. Hedgehogs foraging through English hedgerows seem to extend their nightly range when contrast sharpens between grass and shadow. Naturalists tracking these small animals note shorter, more cautious loops on darker evenings. Even modest creatures, moving low to the ground, appear to weigh the sky before wandering far. A permanent dimming might quietly shrink 1,000 small journeys like these. Along Chile's Atacama coastline, ancient fishing communities built stone fish traps positioned according to how tides receded under steady nightlight. Archaeologists studying these structures find patterns too consistent to be accidental. Timing mattered as much as location. Generations of careful observation shaped stonework that still stands, quietly recording a rhythm borrowed from above. Red foxes hunting through European farmland appear to shift pouncing behavior, depending on how well movement can be seen against open ground. Wildlife researchers watching these hunts note quicker, more confident strikes on clearer nights. Hesitation grows when contrast fades. A single hunting strategy, refined across countless generations, seems partly written by conditions far beyond the fox itself. Venetian glassmakers working through the night once relied on steady outdoor light to judge cooling times for delicate pieces left near open windows. Historical guild records mention certain tasks postponed on unusually dark evenings. Craft depended, in small ways, on conditions no artisan could control. That old dependence hints at how deeply ordinary skill once leaned on the sky. Deep within Tasmanian forests, nocturnal marsupials, called potaroos, appear to forage more widely when contrast between undergrowth and open trail sharpens overnight. Field researchers tracking radio collars note shorter, tighter loops during heavily clouded stretches. Even a small forest floor becomes harder to navigate without that steady contrast. Countless quiet lives, unnoticed by most, would feel this absence first. Along the coast of ancient Carthage, sailors timed harbor departures by watching how clearly the sea's surface held reflected light through early morning hours. Historical accounts describe entire fleets waiting for conditions to steady before setting out. Confidence at sea depended partly on what the sky offered freely. Removing that offering would have reshaped centuries of maritime tradition. Considered across mountains, forests, deserts, and open sea, these gathered habits form a portrait of a planet quietly organized around one steady presence. No single creature understood why it mattered. Each simply built its life around a light that kept returning, night after night, across unimaginable spans of time. That inheritance, woven so deeply into instinct, may be the hardest thing of all to imagine losing. Turkish sponge divers along the Aegean coast once judged safe descent times by watching how clearly the seabed could be seen through shifting water above. Their logbooks, passed down through families, mention certain mornings simply skipped. A trade built on patience and clear water depended on something no diver controlled. That old caution reveals how far this dependence reached. Icelandic shepherds moving flocks down volcanic slopes timed their descents around how well loose rock could be told apart from open path. Elders recall certain routes avoided entirely on the darkest stretches of winter. A misstep among sheep and stone was a risk not worth taking. Instinct and inherited caution shaped an entire seasonal rhythm around a glow overhead. Malaysian fishing villages along mangrove estuaries once timed net casting by how far tidal water pulled back beneath overhanging roots. Elders describe entire seasons organized around this quiet withdrawal and return. Fish gathered where mud met water, and timing meant everything. Generations built an entire livelihood on a pull, felt but rarely explained. Basque whalers sailing from northern Spain centuries ago charted return voyages by watching how clearly distant cliffs held their shape against the horizon. Ship logs mentioned delayed departures when that outline blurred beyond recognition. Navigation in those years leaned on more than compass and stars. A dependable glow across open water often meant the difference between a safe crossing and a lost one. Kangaroo rats foraging across the deserts of the American Southwest appear to shorten their exposed foraging time when the ground holds sharper contrast overhead. Field biologists tracking burrow activity note quicker returns underground on such nights. A creature no larger than a fist has folded caution into instinct across countless generations. Survival, for something so small, has long depended on shadow and open ground alike. Along the fjords of western Norway, herring fleets historically timed their nets to how clearly schools of fish could be traced moving beneath the surface. Fishermen passed down which coves held the clearest water for such work. Entire seasons of catch depended on a glow filtering down through cold water. That old knowledge, refined across generations, still guides a few remaining boats today. Ring-tailed lemurs moving through Madagascar's dry forests appear to extend their nighttime travel routes when contrast sharpens between branches and open sky. Researchers following troop movements note longer foraging paths taken with apparent ease. Even a forest canopy becomes a different world depending on what falls across it. Countless small lives, scattered across distant islands, have quietly leaned on this same gift. Along the salt flats of Bolivia's Uyuni, ancient traders crossing at night navigated by how clearly their own footprints held shadow against the pale ground. Oral histories describe caravans waiting for clearer nights before attempting long crossings. A flat, featureless expanse offered little guidance without that contrast. Even here, in one of the driest places on Earth, an overhead glow-shaped human movement. Corsican shepherds guiding herds through mountain passes once judged safe footing by how clearly loose scree could be separated from solid rock underfoot. Families still recall certain trails saved only for the clearest nights of each month. A single misstep among cliffside paths carried real weight. Caution, passed from one generation to the next, was built quietly around this borrowed glow. Considered across salt flats, fjords, forests, and mountain trails alike, this long list forms something larger than any single habit. Every creature, every tradition, every quiet skill folded itself around a presence that simply kept returning. None of them required understanding why. They only required that it stay, faithfully, night after night, across more seasons than memory could hold. Patagonian gauchos driving cattle across windswept plains once timed long overnight crossings by how clearly a distant ridge could be told from the sky behind it. Old ranch journals still mention certain evenings marked as fit for travel and others best left for rest. A single silhouette against the horizon meant everything to a rider guiding hundreds of animals. That inherited sense of timing outlived the need for it by generations. Fishermen along the coast of ancient Phoenicia charted return routes home by watching how clearly harbor towers stood apart from the surrounding hills. Sailors trusted this small measure more than any map they carried. A blurred horizon meant delay. A clear one meant safe arrival before dawn. Entire trading fortunes depended on judgments made from the deck of a single ship. Deep in New Zealand's glowworm caves, certain insects time their luminous displays partly around subtle shifts in air pressure carried down from the surface above. Cave researchers have noted flickering patterns that seem to answer something beyond the rock itself. A creature that never sees the sky still seems tethered to what happens above it. Life, it turns out, reaches even into places that never felt a single beam. Ethiopian caravan traders crossing the Danakil salt plains once judged safe travel hours by how well their camels' shadows could be traced across the crust beneath them. Guides passed down which weeks offered clearer passage before the heat became unbearable by day. A featureless white expanse held few landmarks beyond what fell across it. Even in one of the hottest places on Earth, timing still bent around an old rhythm from above. 12 centuries ago, Icelandic sagas described travelers crossing frozen rivers only on evenings judged clear enough to trust the ice beneath them. Storytellers passed these accounts down alongside warnings about crossing too soon. A single crack heard in darkness carried real consequence for anyone far from shore. Even frozen water, it seems, was read the same way sailors once read the open sea. Sicilian fishermen working the waters near Mount Etna once timed departures by how clearly volcanic smoke could be traced rising against the sky. Families still recall grandparents refusing to sail on evenings when the plume vanished into haze. A visible column meant calmer air above the strait. Small judgments like these passed quietly through generations, shaped entire fishing seasons. Considered across deserts, rivers, caves, and volcanic coastlines, humanity's long relationship with the sky above has rarely been about wonder alone. It has been about timing, safety, and small daily decisions made with whatever clarity the heavens allowed. Every culture studied so far seems to have folded some version of this trust into its oldest habits. A quiet dependence built without ceremony has simply outlasted the reasons anyone first noticed it. If that dependable presence disappeared tonight, none of these old habits would vanish overnight. Rivers would still freeze, caravans would still cross deserts, and fishermen would still watch their horizons. But the small certainties that guided those choices for thousands of years would begin, slowly, to fade from memory. What took countless generations to build could unravel across only a handful more. Earth would carry on, as it always has, spinning and circling its star with the same patient reliability. Forests would still grow, oceans would still stir, and creatures would still find ways to adapt, as life has done since its earliest beginnings. The absence would be felt less as catastrophe and more as a long, slow quiet settling over everything that once leaned upon that gentle companion. Perhaps this is the truest lesson held within such a question. Something can shape a planet's rhythm so thoroughly that its presence becomes nearly invisible, woven into instinct, memory, and stone alike, and only by imagining its absence do we begin to notice how completely it has always been there, holding countless small lives together in ways none of them ever needed to understand. Long before satellites tracked its path, children in coastal villages were taught to recognize its shape rising each night, learning arithmetic and time through its changing face. Grandmothers used its phases to mark when babies were due, when festivals should begin, when mourning periods ended. Numbers on paper came later. Before that, the sky itself was the calendar every household consulted without needing to ask. In coastal Brazil, fishing communities near Bahia, developed songs whose rhythms mirrored tidal timing, passed between grandfather and grandson as both music and instruction. The melody itself carried information about when nets should be lowered. Losing the tune meant losing the timing. Music, in this sense, became a living almanac disguised as tradition. Himalayan pilgrims climbing toward remote shrines once paced entire journeys around nights bright enough to walk narrow ridges safely. Guides memorized which weeks offered enough glow to avoid torches altogether. A missed window meant waiting nearly a month for another chance. Faith and light, in these mountains, traveled the same narrow path together. Sardinian shepherds, guiding sheep through limestone gorges, timed descents by the brightness cast across pale rock walls, judging footholds invisible on darker evenings. A single misstep among loose stones could end a season's work. So elders passed down not just routes, but the exact weeks each year when the light made those routes survivable. Off the coast of Senegal, women who gathered shellfish along exposed flats timed their harvests around how far the sea withdrew each evening, wading barefoot into shallow pools left glowing under open sky. Baskets filled fastest on nights when withdrawal reached furthest. Their knowledge, refined across lifetimes, turned a passing glow into a livelihood. Welsh coal miners returning home after night shifts sometimes judged how much darkness remained by how high a familiar glow had climbed above the valley ridge. It told them, without any clock, whether dawn approached or still lingered far off, underground for hours. They trusted that single marker the moment they surfaced. Argentine gauchos crossing high desert plateaus timed river fordings around brightness reflected off distant snowmelt, judging depth by how the surface caught available glow. Crossing too early risked drowning a horse in unseen currents. Waiting for the right week became as essential as choosing the right ford itself. Consider for a moment how differently this planet's story might read without such patient companionship overhead. Every tradition traced tonight, from herders to sailors to grandmothers marking calendars, would have needed some other anchor entirely, built through some other trial and adjustment across centuries never lived. Nothing about this companionship was ever guaranteed. Earth might easily have formed without a moon at all, as some smaller planets nearby seem to have. That it arrived, stayed, and shaped so much across billions of years remains one of this solar system's quieter strokes of fortune. Whatever tomorrow holds, tonight the moon remains exactly where it has always been, patient above rooftops, rivers, deserts, and sleeping cities alike. You need not watch for it or wait for its rising to rest beneath its old and steady care. Let your breathing settle, let your thoughts loosen, and let this ancient companion keep its watch tonight. Sleep now and good night. Grandmothers in rural Portugal once taught granddaughters to read the moon's climb above the vineyard rows, marking when to bottle wine so it would keep through the coming year. The timing had no written rule, only memory passed hand to hand. Today, the same slopes still hold vines, planted by those who trusted a light they never fully understood. Bengali river communities along the Gange timed certain ferry crossings by watching how brightly the water held the sky's reflection after dusk. A dull surface warned of coming fog. A bright one promised safe passage until morning. Generations of boatmen carried this small reading of the water as carefully as any map. Consider how many such readings existed at once, scattered across continents that never spoke to one another. A shepherd in Sardinia and a boatman in Bengal shared no language, no meeting, no exchange of ideas, yet both looked upward on the same nights and found the same dependable answer waiting for them. None of these traditions required understanding gravity, or tides, or the slow physics binding two worlds together. A farmer never needed to know why the light returned each month in the same unhurried order. It simply did, and that reliability was enough to build a life around, harvest after harvest, crossing after crossing. Tonight, as you rest beneath whatever sky covers your own rooftop, that same companion continues its unbroken circuit far overhead. It does not know your name, or your worries, or the hour you finally chose to close your eyes. It simply keeps moving, the way it has moved through every night that ever existed before this one. Every question asked tonight about its disappearance was only ever a way of noticing what already surrounds you. The tides you may never watch, the tilt of a planet you stand on without feeling it shift, a light that has touched every ancestor who ever lived, long before any of their names were remembered. You were born already inside this old arrangement, inheriting it the way you inherited breath, or heartbeat, or the slow turning of days into years. No one asked whether you wanted a moon overhead. It was simply there from your very first night, waiting above the room where you first learned to sleep. There is comfort, perhaps, in belonging to something so much older than any single life. Rivers have carried its reflection since before language existed. Mountains have worn down and reformed beneath its watch, and still it rises, unchanged, offering the same pale light to whoever happens to look up on any given evening. So let this be the thought you carry into sleep tonight, rather than any question left unanswered. Somewhere above you, an old companion continues its slow circle, exactly as it has for 4.5 billion years. You do not need to watch it rise. You only need to rest, knowing it will. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress now, and let your breath grow long and even. The moon will keep its watch, whether you notice or not, over oceans, deserts, cities, and quiet rooftops everywhere. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight. Only rest, only stillness, only sleep. Good night.